Okay, so there's a lot of text on these slides, and I'm not going to mention it all, so feel free to kind of like browse and skim and take what you want. It's called Hunger Games. This is a movie in which a group of people who essentially have aligned interests are put into an arena and forced to kind of brutally compete with each other. So my name's Jo. I am an early career researcher, possibly also a late career researcher. I'm also somebody who stayed up late last night applying for 2 academic jobs, so I'm a little bit sleepy, but I'm going to dredge up my CSYS in economics, in which I got a B, and kind of drill down into this term neoliberalism, which we use a lot, and think about how it applies to the university. So the neoliberal university, the corporate university, and this broadly refers to organizational forms that originated in the corporate world, but that originated in the corporate world under the regime of neoliberalism. So what do we say when we try to resist this idea of the neoliberal university? We say education, it's about collaboration, not competition. Education is not a commodity. Students are not customers. But what do we actually mean when we say that? Literally speaking, yes, education is commodified, it's paid for. The students in many ways are customers. So it's a question of how do these forms perhaps damage some kind of pristine reality that's underlying or that's imaginable. So neoliberal, one way of using the term is kind of as a slur. Neoliberal has become a catch-all for anyone with whom you disagree, says the Blairite think tank, The Progressive. And actually I think that's fair enough, and I think it's fair enough to use the term that way. There is a kind of laziness to it. We use neoliberalism as we might use a word like capitalism. But that's a laziness which corresponds to the laziness in those whom it usually critiques, right? A kind of knee-jerk desire for market mechanisms as a one-size-fits-all solution to all social problems. Neoliberalism can also, a little bit more specifically, be thought of as something that's been happening since the decline of the welfare state. So this is a slightly Western-centric view, but you have your first wave of Thatcherism and Reaganomics in the 1980s, an attempt to kind of reboot neoliberalism with Blairism and Clintonomics, to detoxify it a little bit perhaps, and then a more recent kind of unnamed wave since 2008 where you have austerity, you have kind of platform capitalism, and you have these resurgent nationalisms. But neoliberalism also has a longer history. And if we go back to classic liberalism, your basic idea of the price mechanism, and I don't know if Adam Smith uses exactly this kind of formulation, but it's more or less kind of 18th century economics or political economy that we're talking about here. You can kind of create a graph like this, which demonstrates how much of a particular good or service will be supplied at a given price. And you can kind of loosely see the idea that as the price for a particular good rises, production decisions that would have been unprofitable flip over to becoming profitable. So more and more producers enter the market, and existing producers are able to produce more. So that's why you get this kind of upward sloping supply curve. Oh, how convenient! The demand curve slopes down. And again, kind of loosely, you can see that the more expensive something is, the less of it people can afford to buy. They switch their disposable income to different goods. And the idea is that there will be an equilibrium point where these two meet, and at that equilibrium point, the market is cleared. So under certain idealized conditions, there's nobody who wants a good and is willing to pay for that good, but can't find the good. And there is nobody who's made something and can't sell it. So it's a certain type of efficiency, but it's not fair, not just in any way. If we go forward a little bit to the late 19th century, you have Leon Walras, who generalizes this account, right? So he shows how many markets woven together into an interconnected economy can also be cleared spontaneously through the individual actions of actors without any kind of overall coordination. And they can kind of fumble their way to what's called a Pareto Optimum. And Pareto Optimum or Pareto efficiency, again, it's not exactly fair in any way, it's just a certain kind of efficient. What it really means is that nobody, when you've reached this equilibrium, can be made better off unless somebody else is made worse off. But if we think about that, a potential Pareto Optimum is I have everything and you have nothing. I can't make you better off without making myself slightly worse off. So when we start applying this to the university, this is a very limited form of efficiency. And I think maybe in public discourse, when we talk about the marketization of universities, perhaps we shouldn't lean on these words like efficiency, which also have a kind of broader moral underlying sense. Maybe we should actually use the jargon a little bit and say, okay, what you're talking about is Pareto optimality there. Like, do we need Pareto optimality in this particular circumstance? This also only works under very idealized circumstances, which we'll come to in a second. So this is a kind of classic lineage which the early neoliberals seek to reboot. And this is under the context of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Socialism is in the air. And what these early neoliberals, kind of surprising really when you think about how neoliberalism is used today, what they were really trying to do is soften and humanize in certain ways the laissez-faire attitude. So they were looking for delimited roles for the state. The state does have certain roles, certain things that it has to do. But they're afraid of the growth of the state and the impingement on individual liberty. So Friedrich Hayek, the kind of philosophical champion of neoliberalism, gives a kind of political and moral undertone to these ideas, and posits the market as this kind of mystical information processing system that can assemble the little bits of information that are distributed all throughout society and come up with these optimum solutions. And I think it's quite interesting that some of Hayek's ideas are actually the sorts of things that I'd say some humanities departments hold quite dear. So there's this sense of tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge. People don't always know everything that they know. There's a sense of kind of maybe privileging or romanticizing a realm of irreducible aesthetic and moral experience. Humans are all individuals, they're all very different. There are aspects of the humanities and social sciences which disagree with this, which kind of critique anthropocentrism, but I still think that it's an important part of what we do in the humanities. We defend, we protect a kind of fragile realm of irreducible experience against vast impersonal forces, be they networks of state actors, markets, etc. And yet, where does Friedrich Hayek end up? He ends up valorizing brutal competition. These individuals are so unknowable that the only thing we can do with them is jam them together in a big assemblage, a kind of Hunger Games maybe, where their only possible social relations are rivalry. So, what is this circumstance of perfect competition? Well, it is a kind of fairy tale, really. It's nothing that exists in the real world. Things like a huge number of producers and consumers. So, is it a big market? Well, no, it's not. There are 130 universities in the UK. Things like no barriers. Oh, okay. So, in pursuit of a large market, however, you could see how a university might be broken up into smaller units which are required to compete amongst themselves. And here is the poet Kathy Wagner talking about that very process taking place in her university. Every sector of the contemporary university should be financially viable. So each little sector has to be able to kind of turn a profit. No barriers to entry and exit. So this kind of Walrasian equilibrium where we can kind of fumble our way to a Pareto optimum circumstance, that only works if universities can just pop up and disappear at will, right? In response, for example, to changes in price. A university going down in flames is a big deal. People who are in that university might notice. And this is just a little quotation from a short story I wrote about not all competition being good. Nanya's stuck in an epic traffic jam outside Liverpool, and she gets to thinking that if only there was more competition between different cars and lorries and buses and cyclists, that would incentivize all drivers to raise their game. Underperforming vehicles would remove themselves from the road transport marketplace in blood-drenched pile-ups. This would clear the way for more innovative, efficient drivers. So the actual cost of somebody disappearing from the market kind of isn't figured into these calculations. This one I think is really interesting. So fixed preferences. For this to work, the agents in the marketplace have to have a set of fixed preferences. They have to know what they want, and they have to be kind of what economists might call rational, maximizing actors. They always do what will make them happiest given their preferences. But education is a little bit different. Education is about changing who you are. If a student comes out of a degree with the same preferences that they went in with, then I think the degree has failed. And then again, just running quickly through the rest. Perfect knowledge, well, clearly we don't have perfect knowledge, but perhaps that's one of the drivers behind the constant imposition of metrics, league tables, teaching excellence framework, etc. Products are homogeneous. No, they are not homogeneous, although again, maybe this is one of the things that's driving things like the flipped classroom, things that require educators to become more and more mere facilitators while students do the kind of knowledge-sharing work themselves, decentered classrooms. This makes the product a little bit more homogeneous. And factor mobility, in other words, can lecturers just up sticks and move to another university with ease? No. No externalities, no transaction costs, no price controls, like regulate. Basically, it's a terrible, awful fit. But is there more to this neoliberal university than market forces? I think there is, because I think part of it has to do with the way in which subjects are transformed under neoliberalism. And Michel Foucault is one of the kind of early theorists of this process, that neoliberalism turns you into an entrepreneur of yourself, that Homo economicus is somebody who's constantly investing in themselves, trying to better themselves. And this kind of converges with a strain of cruelty, I think, in conservatism since the 1960s. Will Davies says, toughness, even pain, performs an important moral and psychological function in pushing people to come up with solutions. So there's a sense here, really, that if you combine this with Hayek's idea that we have this kind of tacit knowledge, there are these things we know, but we don't know how to express them. We don't know that we know them. They only come out in the process of market competition. There's a kind of connection here with a fascistic proving yourself through rivalry, through struggle, through conflict, showing what you're really made of. And Davies continues, as long as there is an NHS, he's kind of paraphrasing others, this isn't his view, a welfare state and a public sector, we will never truly discover what the British people are made of, because they'll never be forced to find out. And I think this is the inflection on our contemporary work ethic. The kind of thing that you can trace the theorization back to Weber and the Protestant work ethic, but I think in its kind of contemporary incarnation, what we're looking at is something that has an element of suffering for its own sake, cruelty for its own sake, that we're kind of forged in the crucible of our own pain. And I think that's particularly true of any work which has a kind of aura of vocation to it, and that includes both the work of academics and that of students. If there's a sense that what you're doing is fulfilling, then you're kind of not experiencing enough pain. And this links, I think, academic labour to what is sometimes known as socially reproductive labour, a category that kind of emerges in feminist thought in the 1970s, particularly in the context of the wages for housework movement. So traditionally undervalued, marginalised women's work in the domestic sphere, work that is very, very difficult to quantify. And I think it's quite interesting that the university should be a site for this kind of socially reproductive labour, because the university is partly about creating people. It's about forging subjectivities. Teaching and pastoral care, definitely, but also, I think, research. And I think it's quite interesting that the university is in this kind of strange threshold position between the domestic and the public. For many young people, it is leaving home. It's kind of crossing that threshold for the first time. So there's been this word bullshit up there for a while. David Graeber, his recent book, Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, kind of looks at this principle that under the neoliberal regime, we have increasingly been creating work which is perhaps not that socially useful and is perhaps driven by a work ethic that actually prizes competition and even suffering for its own sake. And I'm kind of glossing over some of his details there. But I think what is important is that he distinguishes between shit jobs and bullshit jobs. Now, a shit job is unpleasant, perhaps because the work is intrinsically unpleasant, but that unpleasantness is mostly socially constructed. If you're not well paid, if you're not well treated, if you're not respected for what you do, that's why your job is a shit job. Bullshit jobs, by contrast, is primarily a subjective matter, insofar as you know that what you do is probably not socially useful. And nevertheless, you feel obliged to do it and to pretend that it's useful. He does offer some qualifications. For example, the upper echelons of management, he doesn't think have true bullshit jobs. There's more of a sense of kind of self-mystification. They probably don't recognize it themselves. And he suggests these interesting categories of what might constitute a bullshit job, many of which are in the higher education sector. And he regards this potentially as being because it's this hybrid of the caring sector, as defined in its broader sense as an occupation that involves looking after, nurturing, or furthering the health, well-being, or development of other human beings, and the creative sector. So these are the categories that he picks out. People who do little except increase the status of their bosses, and I think it might be interesting to think about how these social types come up within universities. Goons who convince people to buy things that they don't want, duct tapers who fix the mistakes of senior people who could have just done those things themselves, box tickers who allow organizations to claim they're doing something that they aren't really, and taskmasters who create and supervise bullshit tasks and bullshit work. And he kind of summarizes, as regards to universities, we spend most of our time trying to sell things, grant proposals, book proposals, assessment of students' jobs, etc., etc. So there's a kind of implicit critique here of the idea that only government, only the public sector has this problem with bureaucracy. It's a problem with the public sector, it's a problem with the private sector, and it's a problem with hybrid institutions as well. And Graeber sees the bullshitified workplace as a bullshit storm of resentment, guilt, confusion, stress, and schadenfreude. And I want to kind of make the sweeping suggestion, I'll make it in the form of a question: what right do academics have to non-bullshit jobs if management has to have bullshit ones? I think this is part of the dynamic this is my sweeping statement, this is part of the dynamic that is driving the neoliberalization of the university, right? Insofar as if I am a manager and I'm looking to reform, to improve the way in which academic research and teaching is done in my university, what model do I have to go on? I have my own experience of work. And if I feel that my job is ultimately a bullshit job, I am incensed. I am endlessly incensed by this feeling, this suspicion that academics are somehow doing something valuable and important. And I don't mean to paint management as a villain in that. I mean to say that I feel that I would absolutely 100% feel the same. And I think we actually see that when people cross over from academia into management. We see that psychological change take hold. So what's the solution to that? I don't know. I would like some kind of rapprochement with management, really. I think maybe management should be invited to participate more in the everyday activities of academics, not just the admin side of things. You know, I think that classrooms should be open to them. So, moving to the third and final part, my question is this idea of bullshit work actually maybe may be right to be kind of co-opted by neoliberal energies? Is it the sort of thing that could quite easily slip over into thinking about ways in which we can find more value and get rid of inefficient, unproductive work? And in that vein, so during the recent strike action, this Google Doc popped up. You can see the tiny URL there. It's Eddie Futures, if you want to have a look. And it is of uncertain provenance, but I assume it's mostly kind of Edinburgh academics and quite a few students as well. And it's a really interesting mix of kind of leftist ideas, a lot of them rooted in a kind of Fordist imaginary that wants secure work. I find that one's quite nice, a 5-to-1 maximum pay ratio between the highest and lowest paid, so there's a strong egalitarian impulse there. A mixture of that with some ideas that kind of feel like they are consumer demands, that are maybe kind of more symptomatic of the sense of the student as consumer, but maybe also point to other forms of possible reform that are less rooted in that kind of pre-neoliberal Fordist imaginary, right? That kind of you don't necessarily have to go back to what we had before. What we had before neoliberalism also had problems. Okay, so to conclude with, I want to make two prophecies. And prophecy number one is that, and they're two incompatible prophecies, is that the marketization of higher education will continue. Producers and consumers will become ever more atomized. And it won't just be marketization, it will be securitization. In other words, it will be the financialization of higher education. So essay mills, you know about essay mills, you can purchase an essay online. Why not have a mill for every single function within academia? Why not have a marking mill? Why not have a pastoral care mill? Academics who think that they're being clever by coming up with their subversion excellence frameworks and their strike excellence frameworks are going to find, actually, no, their frameworks are just part of a much larger system. The framework excellence framework. Why should any institution have to face a particular set of criteria that... So the way an excellence framework works, essentially, is by giving you a stern look. And we know that observing any kind of phenomenon changes that phenomenon. So an excellence framework really takes that to the nth degree. It observes, it quantifies, it measures in such a way as to change your behavior. So we can imagine a framework, excellence framework, in which there are multiple excellence frameworks which universities can pick and choose from, and perhaps they can pick and choose in different degrees, hedging their bets. Instead of designing and delivering a module in this future system, you'll issue a knowledge security which will be freely traded. A student, instead of actually attending a course, can build a portfolio of courses and decide the extent to which they want to attend them, or get third parties to attend. Because attendance will be taken very seriously, but part of taking it seriously is obviously finding out who is best placed to attend. You might have somebody who's very, very good at attending, so they can kind of sell their services. So the most competitive providers can do that. Knowledge securities can then form the basis of derivative instruments which kind of chop up these learning outcomes and repackage them. For example, default credulity swaps. What we study should also offer the maximum possible choice. So for example, in English literature, we'll have a canon that consists of Borges' library. In other words, every single possible text, I assume procedurally generated, will exist and will be available for study. For example, Lana Turner has collapsed. Oh, Lana Turner, get up, you're too big to fail. Knowledge bubbles will periodically appear and burst, like that might be a real poem for a while, and then it won't be anymore. Most trading will be automated. Most students and staff will be algorithms. The effective and social reproductive aspect of university education is also integrated into the system. So one of the things that an university education does for you is it gives you, well, you might call it transferable skills, but it's a little bit more than that. An old-fashioned way of putting it would be a moral education. It allows you to be a particular person in a particular situation later on in your life. Now, if you find that you haven't actually exactly literally attended any of these modules, and so you're not capable of the kinds of insights, effective labor, and the kinds of behaviors that attendance would have inculcated in you as a subject, that's okay. So long as you've got it in your portfolio, you can instantiate a system of institutions in which persuasion architectures will allow you to act as though you had done what you should have done had you known what you should have known. You can, for example, unfall out with your friend, so long as you have kind of the right moral knowledge somewhere in your portfolio. Exactly how your friend will be persuaded to kind of treat that as reality, that will be sorted out by the market. And just as stock markets are now prone to flash crashes, where the interaction of multiple algorithms causes value to be kind of knocked off inexplicably and unaccountably before bouncing back, so too will knowledge be prone to these inexplicable, violent, and probably temporary mutations. For 20 minutes we will all know everything, or we will all only know one thing, or we will all be highly qualified forensic anthropologists. Okay, so that's the first prophecy. The second prophecy, and the first prophecy is not entirely serious. The second prophecy is that neoliberal economists actually recognize that markets don't form naturally, and that the informational properties diverge from that kind of Walrasian neoclassical model that we were talking about. And over the course of the 3 waves of neoliberalism, which we identified earlier, which has also been the period of the growth and growing sophistication of information technology, there has been a corresponding growth of market design economics. And this is a wide and broad field, but a very obvious example of it is these digital platforms, things like Airbnb, Uber, Deliveroo. These are arguably privatized markets. So what I think will happen in the future is that a workable humanized market or market-like structure will emerge in the higher education sector. That it will be nothing at all like the early neoliberal neoclassical models we've described, or anything at all like that sarcastic first prophecy. What it will be is humanized with the worst absurdities weeded out. There will be excellence frameworks that more or less work. Research will be more or less supported. There will be things like caps on the number of applications that any particular person can make within a particular period of time to cut down on wasted applications, wasted labor. It will be something that doesn't happen automatically. It will be a big, supposedly inspirational struggle, which will absorb a lot of the energy of the intellectual class. The academy will look after itself. What makes this an equally dystopian vision, in my view, is that the outside world won't necessarily be doing the same. I think the academy will sustain itself as a haven, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to crumble when everything else does. Thank you, everybody.